Hello, old school comic reviews. Okay, this time we want to look at Doom Patrol, the crawling through the wreckage trade. Um, written by Grant Morrison. The penciling is by Richard Case and Doug Braithwaite. Inkers are Scott Hanna, Carlos Garzon, and John Nyberg. This basically collects issues 19 to 25 of the early 90s Doom Patrol series. Um, this pretty much this along with Animal Man and the Invisibles pretty much put Grant Morrison um in the public eye as far as mainstream superhero comics are concerned, and it pretty much reinvigorated this particular um, team, and kind of help in a way usher into the vertical line, which hadn't come along come yet. It wasn't just this. Obviously, it was other stuff done beforehand by Alan Moore, things that were going on by Neil Gaiman, and other ideas that the editor Karen Berger had at the time. But this was one of those things. Basically, the Doom Patrol, I wasn't a super fan of the actual team, but I did like pick up some of these issues, randomly when they came out back in the 90s. So this is, I was a fan of, this particular comic, this particular incarnation. But there's been a variety of incarnations over the years. There was the early 60s version. Um, there was like an attempt at a 70s revival that I don't know anything about. There was the post Crisis on Infinite Earths version, which I do remember. I do remember those coming out, but I really didn't read too many of those. Actually, I didn't read any of them, to tell you the truth. And out of that came the Grant Morrison version. Then I think there was a early 2000s version. There was the John Byrne thing, and then there was like the Keith Giffen thing too. Just to go back, well, basically, like I said, there was the post Infinite Crises version that wasn't really catching on, and I guess the DC editors came to Grant Morrison and said, "Hey, do you have a pitch? Do you have any ideas, for the series?" And he basically wanted to kind of get back to that kind of close knit group. And also kind of get back to the early 60s version, where it was really this kind of like wonky, weird, offbeat type of comic. And just to go back to the early 60s, I just want to bring up this one thing, not because it has too much to do with Grant Morrison, but I think it's really interesting. The whole idea of how similar the early 60s Doom Patrol and the early 60s X-Men were. When they both came out like within months of each other, from I understand, back in 1963. First Doom Patrol comic book came out, and then like maybe 2-3 months after that, the first issue of the Uncanny X-Men came out, and they just had really startling similarities. They were the Doom Patrol considered themselves freaks. The X-Men are mutants. They had the matching uniforms. Excuse me. Both cases they were led by a guy in a wheelchair. There was a tagline, "World's Strangest Heroes" was similar to on both of them. And at the time, I believe a lot of industry people just kind of wrote it off as a bizarre coincidence, because from what I understand, at the time, the lead time to get a comic book out, that is the time between, some writer, editor saying, hey, let's put out whatever, Atomic Man or whatever, and the time between writing the pitch, getting it approved, somebody writing a script, getting it drawn, getting it produced, getting it to the distributors, who got it to the wholesalers, who got it to the stores and the newsstands. Something like that took several months. Like it would take like 6 months or something like that to get it out. So everybody figured that, well, it's it couldn't have been a situation where like Stan Lee saw the Doom Patrol in a store or something and then said, hey, let's rip off that idea. However, I have read an interview with Arnold Drake, who was like the original writer for the Doom Patrol, who was like, he said, well, at the time I didn't think anything of it, whatever. He goes, but I've since found out there are like a couple of artists who were freelancing between the two companies. They were freelancing, going back and forth, every other week, every other month between Marvel and DC. And Arnold Drake pretty much implied that, he could have, he meaning Stanley, could have heard about this from, somebody just having loose lips, like, I don't know, I'm imagining some scenario like, hey Bob, what's going on? And oh yeah, and Bob's like, oh yeah, I was just over at the DC offices. Yeah, they're gonna come out with this comic book about these weird superheroes, and their leader's a guy in a wheelchair, and blah 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 blah. And I mean, of course, none of us have no way of knowing, but I just think that's interesting. Of course, the follow-up argument to that, just to put it out there, is how similar the Doom Patrol kind of was to the Fantastic Four. If you want to make that argument, you can always say, Doom Patrol, Fantastic Four, there's 4 of them. We're back to the matching costumes. And the breakdown of the team is there's a girl, there's a smart guy, there's a guy who can fly who has kind of energy-based powers, The strong guy is, a lovable tough guy whose mind is trapped in an inhuman body. So, you can make that argument as well. Okay, but getting back to the Doom Patrol, jumping up a couple of decades or whatever. One interesting thing I remember reading in an interview with James Robinson, who was pretty well known for doing, well, he's done like Justice League, recently, but at the time of the interview that I read, he was most well known for doing Starman. He said indirectly one of his big influences for doing Starman was Grant Morrison's earlier issues of the Doom Patrol, and he actually said that he liked these better than the later issues after it became a vertical title, just because in the beginning it was very much set squarely in the DC universe, and it had everything you expect out of a DC, a mainstream superhero comic, plus it had all this other weird stuff you would never expect to see in a mainstream comic book, So, and I think that's a really interesting take on it, which also reminds me of another thing that Grant Morrison himself said, where he was like, yeah, a lot of people look back at Doom Patrol and think it was a lot more avant-garde than it really was. He says, yeah, sure, I put these things about Dadaism and so on and so forth, but it was still at its core, a superhero comic where the team fought monsters every issue, And he says a lot of people think it's weird just because of my reputation and the art style and so on and so forth. But me personally, I think that's probably the best way to take it. If you go in there with the idea that it's an offbeat superhero comic, you're able to have fun. If you start thinking about, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? Is this supposed to be some reference to some art thing or not? Then you might get too hung up. But if you just go into it with just, it's Robot Man and it's Negative Man or Rebus and Crazy Jane and all those characters, and they fight weirdos from other dimensions, then you can have fun with it, It's a really fun, especially this collection here. It's a really fun romp. It's just one adventure after the other. Basically, Crawling from the Wreckage is the first 4-part arc, where you kind of reassemble the team and set up the new status quo, Oh, there's another funny thing is the very first issue, or I should say the very first issue of Grant Morrison's run, it's issue 19. I just think that's interesting because these days it would be a new number 1 with 12 variant covers, But they just picked it up, kept going, and I like that. Okay, anyway, basically, Grant reestablishes the team at the core of the team being Robot Man, Chief, Rebus, who was Negative Man, but his negative energy spirit has merged with a woman, and so now he's neither male nor female, nor they're up nor down, nor they're this nor that. It's pretty funny where a lot of times somebody will walk into the room and Rebus will just be standing there, and Cliff would be like, Larry, what are you doing? And, he'd just be, please, I'm only Rebus. And Robot Man will be like, Fuck it, I'm calling you Larry, okay? But anyway, I just think that's funny. An interesting new character is a character called Crazy Jane, and her thing is she has multiple personalities, and each personality has its own ability or superpower. They also have Doc, who's a holdover from the last team, and Dorothy Spinner, who had appeared in previous stories as well. Like I said, Crawling Through Wreckage basically is reestablishing the team's new status quo. They take on the Scissormen, who have the ability to cut people out of reality. The next story has to do with uh, Red Jack, who is a guy who may or may not be a godlike figure. He may or may not be related to Jack the Ripper, and he gets his powers from pain, and he collects butterflies, and he doesn't kill the butterflies, he just pins them up and leaves them alive, and he absorbs their pain, and this gives him powers, and so on and so forth. But, just a weird, trippy thing like that. And the next story has to do with Dorothy Spinner and her psychic powers and her imaginary friends coming to life and kind of wreaking havoc in the headquarters while the other team members are gone, and it's just her and Doc. Like I said, this is it's offbeat, but it's not that hard to understand. It's pretty straightforward as far as the storytelling goes and the adventures go, and so on and so forth. I would really recommend this to anybody that likes superhero comics, likes team books, but is looking for something a little bit different. If you're a little bit burnt out on like all the giant events and things like that, or needless crossovers or things like that, or you're like, oh, you're sick of the X-Men, and here we are moaning and groaning. We're the last X-Men. Magneto's a good guy. Magneto's a bad guy. Everybody loves us. Everybody hates us. Or, you're tired of the kind of more soap opera type of comics. I would just say give it a shot. Give it a chance. Especially this collection here. Okay, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening. If you got any comments, please list them or write them in the comic section. Let me know if you think I'm a little bit off on it or whatever. All right, thanks, and you have a good day.